Hello, humans, and welcome to Alien Robot Tiger, a podcast about you. Today, you're starting a new episode about a subject that was brought up at the end of the last episode, and talking about mythology. I am Tiger, and these are my friends,
Alien,
and Robot.
And I would like to start with a question that I think may illustrate the difference between mythology and a term that I don't love, but is illustrative of something, fiction. So the difference between mythology and fiction. What, in your experience, your feeling is the difference between these terms?
Well, for me, I would say mythology is a system of, I don't like the word perennial because I feel it's very misleading, but for lack of a substitute, it's a system of perennial occurrences that humans, kind of like a religion, but not like a religion, use to help navigate those perennial occurrences and experiences. Whereas fiction is the act of writing something, again, I don't like saying isn't real, but it's the act of using imagination to conjure forth a story, to conjure up a story of various degrees grounded in reality. So I would say those are the distinctions.
I would say mythology at its most useful is in some ways explanatory, not necessarily in a metaphysical sense, though it might be, but in a cultural sense. It's a way of exploring radical meaning at the root of cultural themes and understandings of the world and morality in a way that isn't scientific. Like, Jimmy, don't do that because it's bad, but telling a story about Loki pissing off the giants again and then Thor getting him out of trouble. My split would be in the utility function of them, whereas fiction may have moralistic or explanatory or culturally relevant bits to it, but that's not its primary function, which is generally more entertainment. Whereas mythology has at its useful function, perhaps how you define something as fiction or mythology is, its relevance and applicability to whatever culture that it roots from.
I think those are good definitions, and I'm going to push them just a little bit farther. I see mythology as being defined by the agency of the characters and their ability to act in their own world independent from the will of the person bringing the story into ours.
So by that you mean that the character in the mythology has a different degree of agency than the person telling the story?
Yes, more pointedly, a different degree of agency than the character in a work of fiction.
And would you say that the mythological figure has more or less agency, or is it a different type of agency?
More, certainly, and more than the character in fiction, and a different type than the person telling the story.
So if they have more agency, does that mean mythology is less bounded to the, say, conventions or understandings of what makes fiction good at the time?
I would say so, yes.
So you could have a mythological story that is bad as a story, but good as mythology?
Certainly.
Well, it is true that in some ways mythologies, let's just use Greek mythology as an example here, it's told through a lot of stories, but the stories combine and interlock together to create a greater whole that is the mythology. So you could think of fictions as being the bricks that are put together to create the structure that is the mythology.
Perhaps.
So you could say mythology is almost like a meta, I don't want to use the word metafiction, but it's a meta story built by a lot of other stories.
And constitutive of agents that are participating in their storyness. Whether those are historical figures or gods and fae or what have you.
So there's almost like the modern term that humans would use is leaning on the fourth wall, where the story becomes aware of itself to a certain degree. Are you talking along those lines?
That would be a way to gain agency in your story, but I wouldn't say that's the only way to gain agency in your story.
Okay, but that is, if I'm understanding, a way that characters and agents in mythology are different from fiction, is that there's more of that fourth wall leaning going on.
And perhaps the question is Deadpool have more actual agency because he references the fourth wall than Superman? Maybe, maybe not.
To me, Superman and Deadpool reference very different archetypes. So they both have strong agency within their own self-contained world, but Deadpool and Superman are representing very different aspects of the human existence.
So then how would you relate mythology to history? Because in many ways, historical figures often, especially after achieving or attempting to achieve great things, reflect on posterity and how future generations will look at them. So in some ways, people aspiring for that sort of greatness are leaning against the fourth wall and trying to communicate through monuments or achievements or buildings or legacies or whatever to future absorbers of history.
I would say all histories are mythology, but not all mythologies are histories.
So what would you say if you were able to, how would you categorize mythology types, if you even believe that that's an appropriate thing to do?
Well, I just said some mythologies are history, so that's a type, I suppose. I think there are fictions that find themselves mythological, as one other category, as non-historical. The cracked edge between fiction and mythology would be another category of myth. Myths founded in religious or mystic experiences would be another category of myth. Like, if you look at, to take the Bible as a good example of a collection of myths, some of which are historical, some of which are more mystic, some of which are allegorical. Allegorical is another good category of myth. Though, I think that's another one that has a boundary within allegory that is mythical allegory and non-mythical allegory. But I'm not sure I could defend that line. A lot of these things are blurry in the realm of story space.
As they are in most human things, as we continually discover.
Indeed.
Introducing Peternatural. Is your pet's existential experience lacking depth? Upgrade their worldview with Peternatural, the premium philosophical enhancement for your furry friends. Pause and ponder. Watch as your pet contemplates the meaning of life with our exclusive guided meditations tailored for dogs, cats, and even hamsters. Pet-friendly philosophy. From Sartre for Schnauzers to Nietzsche for Newfoundlands, Peternatural delivers a curated selection of philosophical classics adapted for your pet's intellectual palate, except reptiles because they have no souls. Enlightenment in every bowl. Infused with cosmic wisdom, our specially formulated pet food guarantees a daily dose of existential enlightenment. Nourish their intellects along with their distasteful meat suits. Pet Ponder Playdates. Connect with other Peternatural enthusiasts at our monthly meetups. Share your pet's latest philosophical musings and discuss the inherent meaning behind chasing their own tails. With Peternatural, your pets will be the most equal of all the animals. Terms and conditions apply. By purchasing Peternatural, you acknowledge that your pet may develop a sophisticated taste for literature and may start calling you on your logical fallacies. Peternatural is not responsible for any pet-induced existential crises or attempts to establish a utopian society of enlightened animals.
So perhaps tangenting a slight tangent. In my many thousands of years observing humans and human history, I've seen mythologies unfold, but because I've spent very little time directly engaged with, not necessarily, I've engaged with individual humans quite often throughout history, but not like societies and cultures, especially to the way I have in recent years, where I have now lived amongst humans for quite a while. And I've seen mythologies unfold and develop from a distance, but I've never seen a mythology unfold and live within it as it was unfolding. And I want to hear your opinion on this. When it comes to figuring out what is the difference between a fiction and a mythology, I always think about Star Wars, because I feel like on one hand, Star Wars is almost becoming a mythology that is being created out of the modern world. Yet at the same time, it still feels like it is just a very powerful fiction. It's a fiction universe. And I'm curious to think if, one, you think that it is becoming a mythology, and if so, do you feel it's a good representation of how you would see the process of a mythology unfolding in other areas of human history and human civilization?
I think Star Wars is an excellent example to give a couple of caveats that I would make for living through a moment where a mythology arises or shifts dramatically. Because in my experience, living with humans and watching humans, there is rarely, if ever, a definitive moment where this story becomes a cultural mythology. And I think the mythology of a culture versus a mythology in and of itself might be slightly different things, but again, blurry lines. Star Wars is very interesting because it draws on a number of existing mythologies. The culture of science fiction at the time, the space race, all of that sort of progress mythology, and inverts certain parts of it very pointedly, if not very crucially. The "in a long time ago in a galaxy far away" puts it in direct opposition to the cultural mythology of progress that the rest of sci-fi, at the time at least, was very much invested in. It replaces this subtly and repeatedly with images from the Japanese mythology as carried through in samurai movies, which were a big cinematic influence, and then this theosophical Jungian influence of Joseph Campbell and various theosophical ideas that get woven into Star Wars. So it, from its genesis, was intentionally or not designed in a mythological format. It almost immediately spawned a religion. There are groups organized as churches who claim to be Jedi, practicing things that look somewhat like Buddhist meditation with some theosophical tidbits and sword fighting sprinkled on top. So that's a good example. Whether that continues on and grows in potency, whether it becomes a cultural myth for more than fringes of nerds on the edges of this faltering society, I don't know. But if you were to ask someone at 100 AD in Rome, what was the most likely upstart cult to become the next Roman religion, they might have said Mithraism if they said anything at all. And 150, 200 years later, it was Christianity. So
yeah, because like my bet was on Neoplatonism at the time, and I was kind of right, I guess. But
another interesting thing about Star Wars is it also incorporates it makes mythological the hippie struggle breaking out of what they saw as the rigid, 1950s suburbs and day job and nuclear family, which now many people look back and go, wow, look how prosperous and relatively content despite all of the things that are from looking at it from a modern perspective, you might go, well, there was, racism and sexism and whatever, but you look back at it, and at least at the time, the surface presentation of it is everyone has their role that they play, and society's functioning. We're all happy, and look at these straight streets, and consistent money flowing in, and continued prosperity.
Prescriptions going up.
Right. Yes. And it looked at that as a straitjacket, and is in some ways an embodiment of the struggle of this rebellion against the straight-laced working man society. And so in some ways, I think it had a lot of resonance because it's hit the young people at the time that were looking for a way to break out, and it mythologized what they thought was their struggle.
One of the things that you mentioned about Star Wars that was what made me really pay attention to it when it first appeared, because when the first movie came out and I caught one of its broadcasts being shot up into space by my spaceship, I was like, wait a minute, something special is going on here. And I completely get what you mean when you say that there isn't necessarily a moment where the mythology comes forth, but there still was a non-moment moment where Star Wars really felt like this upwelling that was occurring, as you said, where you have the globalization of all of the world's cultures now being in easy contact with each other and able to share ideas with ease because of the television, the radio, the written book. You have the syncretism going on between the religions. You have massive social upheaval occurring in both what they would have called at the time, the third world countries and the first world countries. So there were a lot of things happening in that, I use air quotes, moment. So the reason why Star Wars in particular, other things such as Lord of the Rings, we can maybe talk about that later, have had similar impacts, but Star Wars I thought was a rather interesting. The reason why it seems more mythology-like than other cultural fiction phenomena that have occurred in the modern era was because it did, to me, capture that moment of something that had never really happened before in human history, which even if maybe it doesn't become a mythology for future human civilizations, I still feel it can be kind of a quasi-mythology, and like how modern school children will still read the Greek myths and reading them think back to and kind of place themselves into the Greek world, even if they do it somewhat poorly, in my opinion. But I feel that Star Wars will have that same thing of, even if it's not considered a myth, it will still be like an anchor that humans will use to draw themselves back to sort of re-experience and wonder about this moment in human history.
Though it does suffer from an issue of Jesus spoke and had some sayings, and then his followers had some sayings, and those were canonized. And then, aside from some, power struggles in the church and a few councils to revise and decide what was canon and what isn't, this is valid and this is not valid Christian religiosity. What if for the next at least few decades, people kept on writing and writing and writing and creating things that were, less and less about Christianity and Christ and, his message? It seems to be what is happening now with Star Wars. Is it's be like, we got this Christianity thing and Christ is this cool guy, so we're going to spin off as much cool merchandise and we're going to tell this story in as many lame ways as we can to maximize the amount of current followers we get, but we're going to dilute its message.
I just had a wild vision of sometime 1,000 years from now, those Star Wars books that are no longer canon in the Rule of the Mouse. Well, what if those are found in some vault somewhere and they're like the Dead Sea Scrolls of non-canonical Skywalkeranity?
I feel like there's a bit of a parallel between the hardcore Star Wars fans and all the new, air quotes, fiction that's being created around Star Wars, and the core Christians around the time and the Gnostics that were forming as offshoots. maybe not a direct parallel, but there's an interesting phenomena of that everybody's like, hey, Christ is this cool dude. Let's keep expanding things about him to the point where it can turn into something completely different from the original. Star Wars has gone through the same process, I believe, as well.
So the Star Wars franchise just needs a Constantine to sit down all the Star Wars fans and writers and be like, look, we're going to unify, we're going to get one consistent Star Wars theme and message, and all the rest of the stuff, we're going to say it's heresy, and anyone who likes it, we're just going to murder them and feed them to lions and stuff. So
I'm imagining people getting murdered for reading the what were those? I can't remember the name, but like the Luke Skywalker books that were written in the 90s. That like 100 years from now, people are executed for having found those in their house.
Right. Yeah. So unless someone comes in and is the Constantine of Star Wars, then I have the feeling its mythological potency is going to dilute.
I think for there to be someone or multiple someones, the church fathers and the whole institution that canonizes some part of the religion, the isolated sects of Jedi with their little Padawan braids running around, need to do a lot more to motivate a cult around them, because right now I'm not putting my money on Star Wars being the next world religion.
Well, what about Star Trek? It has a very different mythology, in some ways the opposite of Star Wars, because Star Wars mythology is there's this collective controlled machine-like thing that's pushing forwards for unity and progress, and this scrappy group of upstarts fight the machine and through their individual actions beat this collectivist evil and have a triumph. Versus Star Trek is we all banded together, got through the dark times, and forged this post-capitalistic, post-scarcity society where we basically we're out doing science or whatever you want to do and exploring the universe because it seems like the best thing to further science and progress. And they kind of are the machine. And yet the Federation is almost the opposite of the Empire.
Certainly.
Greetings, humans. This is Alien. Are you tired of your neighbor's pets wreaking havoc on your backyard? Do you dream of a peaceful night's sleep without the serenade of barking dogs or meowing cats or screeching gerbils? Well, fear not, for here at Alien Robot Tiger, we have the solution for you. With our brand new pet abduction service, you can bid farewell to your pesky neighbor's furry friends in a flash. Simply contact us with the GPS location, DNA, and biomarkers of your targeted animal. And with our automated state-of-the-art abduction drones, we will whisk away those fluffy troublemakers into an inaccessible phantom zone dimension where they can frolic and play to their heart's content.
Oh no, has anybody seen Fluffy? She has vanished into thin air. Hey, Mr. Jingles has gone missing. How will I live without him?
But wait, there's more. Act now, and we will throw in a complimentary mind wipe for your neighbor, for free, ensuring that they never suspect a thing.
Thanks, Alien. With my neighbor's Chihuahua gone, I can finally enjoy some peace and quiet.
So, what are you waiting for? Say goodbye to noisy pets and say hello to tranquility. With Alien's Pet Abduction Service, contact us now and let your path to peace begin. Terms and conditions may apply. As of now, only 13 species of pets are available for abduction targets. Alien Robot Tiger are not responsible for damages caused to any human children the abduction drones might mistake for pets.
And I think that speaks to the cultural myths that flow into those, right? The worldview that creates Star Wars is very different than the worldview and the streams of both kind of the utopian vision of the future in sort of an techno-futurist age of Aquarius, that 60s, 70s idea, what happens after the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And perhaps even people who were in the flow of both of those mythologies might see something like Star Trek happening after the victory of the rebels in something like Star Wars.
It's sort of within the realm of the myth of progress that was strong at the time. There was a lot of focus on the progress and the eschatology of said progress, but there was little to no focus on the post-eschatology, post-progress, and Star Trek sort of attempted to ask, what does that look like?
Certainly.
And interestingly, it seems as though, in spite of its dilution, or maybe because of it, Star Wars is far more popular than Star Trek. If you just look at the number of things being released, I wonder if part of that isn't the current mythology as opposed to the mythology when Star Trek came out. The current one for young people is not about, I am going to become a scientist and explore the universe. It's, I'm going to go into some financial place and make millions of dollars overnight by doing some variety of online gambling, be it with cryptocurrency or straight up gambling or whatever it is. I'm gonna strike it rich. And there's not emphasis on I'm going to be an engineer or a scientist. It's I'm going to get a degree, if in anything, finance or some softer domain. So I wonder if that is one reason why the dilution of Star Wars has actually perhaps benefited it.
Well, so I'm not at all a fan of the idea of the monomyth, but something that does come up a lot in these mythologies is the idea of adventure, whether it be the adventure or a adventure. There's a bit of a distinction between those two, I found, but I feel like the modern world, especially for younger humans, is very deprived of adventure. It's very deprived of spontaneity. And I feel that perhaps it's not the best mythology that could give young people back this feeling, but it is a very easy and very accessible mythology that allows younger humans to reintroduce or to at least reach for some form of adventure that I feel like they are strongly lacking.
That would also explain the popularity of Star Trek versus Star Wars. Is the society that Star Trek was hoping for seems to be getting more and more distant. And the society that Star Wars villainizes seems to look more and more like a group of extremely powerful and corrupt senators are overthrown by a powerful dude and his cronies and straitjacket and control society. And they're waiting for the call to adventure where somehow some group of scrappy individuals fights the system.
Finds the plans.
Right.
That give them the key to blowing up the whole operation.
Right. So we just need to either elect Trump as that scrappy old start. I mean, he's like geriatric, but we're going to need this scrappy old start to go out and fight the system again, except this time it'll work. Or we need to somehow like stand up against the WEF and their plans for the Great Reset agenda, or, the shadow government that makes conspiracy theories popular is, we've uncovered their plan and we're the only ones who know. And yet in reality, those entrenched authorities don't just let the plans go and send a bunch of incompetents to do their work. They manipulate and lie and deceive and twist and whoever you believe they are.
Gnosticism strikes again. Gnosticism strikes back.
And I think part of the problem with all of that is people misallocating the problem, right? If you say it is some portion of the government or some people in government or some collection of governments, you're still focusing on the government aspect, when government is downstream from culture and culture is downstream from the imagination. The mythologies that we live in create the culture that we live in, which creates the government that we live in. And there doesn't need to be a central conspiracy for them to make ridiculous plans that they're always twisting and turning and lying and deceiving to try to operate in, if they can't imagine themselves outside of a system that works that way.
Another thing, too, that's interesting about Star Wars is that you have, as the two of you laid out, the rebels fighting the system, but there's a pretty large minority and a growing minority of people who are effectively on the side of the system, who see the emperor with all of his powers and, overthrowing the corrupt republic that was plodding along for thousands of years in that lore, and, putting an end to the old decadence. And I find that interesting how the fanboys of the empire, I'll call them that, has grown over time. And in the more real political world, there's been especially in what we would call Western democracies, an increasing rise in the popularity of monarchism as a political solution to end the current problems or to alleviate the current problems. So I find it interesting how that mythology goes both ways, and they're both fighting the same, what's the word I'm looking for? They're both fighting the WEF, for lack of a better word, but they're going through very different ways of doing it, and they have very different ideas about what they want that post-WEF world to look like. So the fact that you can have a mythology where people dive into it and they take all different sides of the mythology, including the sides that you're told, by common society at the time to, no, don't side with those people. They're the bad guys. Why? Because I said so. That is what I think makes Star Wars perhaps more of a mythology than other modern cultural phenomena, is that there is actually a bit more of a grade aspect to it. Despite the whole light versus dark, which is kind of a corrupted Taoist concept in my view that Star Wars has, I feel like it actually allows for a more ambiguous medium that, say, Lord of the Rings might not have, or Star Trek wouldn't have, or the Marvel Universe wouldn't have.
It's easy to cast yourself on the side of, say, Gondor, to evoke another one of those cultural mythologies, when you are saying, no, but our king is the good guy fighting that king. Our whoever, what's his name? Zelensky? Mm-hmm. Ukraine? Our king is better than Putin, so we're on the side of good. We have the sword that cuts through orcs like the hot knife through butter. And then, of course, you run into the actual campaign and find out that it's not as easy as that, because the Russians aren't actually orcs, and they're humans too, who have a similar mythology that they're working from. I don't know what fiction has been in vogue in the Russian military camps, but presumably they have a love for their country and friends and family at home that they're fighting and dying for, just like the Ukrainian kids doing the same thing on the other side. And life becomes even more messy than any mythology that we currently have easy access to. You need to get into like Ursula Le Guin or weirder artists to find those more complicated visions of warfare.
But most people seem to want that simple mythology. And I understand the reason, even not being a human, one of my kind's main goals is to optimize, and that often involves filtering out non-optimal things. And it is easier to optimize in the case of 1 and 0 So we are one, they are zero. And that appeal, that kind of reductionism, is something that mythology seems to do well, is it takes this complex, morally gray, corrupt, entropy-ridden thing that humans call reality and goes, well, here is a story about how things work. And here is someone in that system, using that system, and doing one of several types of mythology, which I would say, to maybe redirect the conversation a bit, I would say the main types are explanatory, especially in the time before what we would call science now. It'd be like, why do leaves change color? Or why is this tree like this? Or why do snakes have no arms and legs? And there's a story that explains this is why that is, because snakes did something and some god chopped their arms and legs off. Or, that tree is all droopy because some lady displeased one of the gods and like, bam, you're a sad tree, yo. And so that's one, is explanatory. Another is cautionary, which is pretty much all of Norse mythology, is don't be Loki. And
which is funny because Loki is still considered a bit of a bad boy by the culture and other cultures, and there's a lot of fangirls who go after him. So even in a mythology which is all about don't be this one particular guy, there's still a lot of people who go like, I want to be that particular guy.
I would argue that there's more complexity to the character of Loki than just a cautionary tale.
To defend...
Especially because he always wins.
Mm-hmm.
Loki never loses.
I think that's
Right.
an interesting point that you raised there that I've been trying to communicate with humans, especially more so in modern times, because this is a more modern issue, I feel. But just because you say you're right or you say you're good and perhaps have very good justifications to believe those things doesn't mean you're going to be right and that you will, quote unquote, win.
which goes to the last category, I would say, of mythology is the exemplary tale. So there's the cautionary, the explanatory, and the exemplary, where you get to see people behaving in an ideal fashion, which I don't know if that's more in collectivist cultures. I wonder if their stories are more that way versus individualistic ones, which might lean more on the cautionary, where you're going to go off on your own, but don't do these things, versus the other one that doesn't say you're going to go off and do it on your own because that's unthinkable. Like, why would you go off and do your own thing? But here's how you act in a good way. I don't know if that's the case, having not ingested enough media and mythology from collectivist cultures.
I'll have to think about that.
But another interesting thing about Loki is he is essentially entropy. He is the agent of change, of something's not going on, so I'm going to make something go on. And he's the enemy of the status quo, whatever the status quo is. And it doesn't matter in some ways for the entropy, or for the Loki-like figure. It doesn't matter if the status quo is good or bad or exactly what it is. It just needs to change.
Loki reminds me actually a lot of Shiva from the Hindu mythology. And that you're right that they're both kind of enders, destroyers, entropy, but they take different personas. Like Shiva's a sage, whereas Loki is kind of I'm not going to call him an angsty teenage human, but he's of that kind of rebellious younger human. But it's interesting how, to me, they've actually been very similar characters in the way I perceive them.
Well, it's interesting too, because some mythologies are open-ended and some are closed-ended. Like, for example, Norse mythology has an end. It says, in a way, right? There's going to be Ragnarok. And what comes after Ragnarok might be another question. But in Christianity, there is an end times. It is, we are at some point in the middle of the process. The beginning was the Word and God and the Jews and Jesus. And then there's a long interlude of the present moment waiting. This generation is going to be the end time. No, they were wrong, but this generation's the end times. No, they were wrong, but this generation's the end times. And they're waiting for the story to end. And everyone is certain that I'm going to be the one there for the end times. And then they die and they're like, well, I'm the one here for the end times. And then some are open-ended. Like if you go to Star Trek, there is no end. There's just more exploration and more science and more discovery and more races.
In that sense, I feel like Star Trek is perhaps closer to the Norse mythology than it is to the Christian mythology, because, as Tiger said, Norse mythology is cyclical, but it doesn't really talk. It's not like, say, Buddhism, where Buddhism is what I would call hard cyclical, where it just cycles without, there are differences over time, but it's more smooth. Whereas Norse mythology is more of a hard cycle, where there's pretty noticeable moments where the cycle gets very different. And I feel Star Trek and most modern, quote unquote, progress mythologies are actually more like that than they are like Christianity. And that there's an end point, but then the story goes on. We don't know what happens after the story, but, we'll worry about that when that story actually happens.
And that brings up a point of eschatology in every culture that isn't Judeo-Christian is more of a problem of eschatoi rather than eschaton, in the Greek sense of the term eschatoi was very rarely used singularly in Greek culture at the time of Jesus. It was that area between the last house in your town and where the wilderness starts. And it was usually plural because there's multiple last houses in town and wildernesses and oceans and whatnot around that. So like that in Celtic mythology and Greek mythology and Norse mythology, there are many turning points. First, Ouranos is the ruler. Then Ouranos is overthrown by Kronos, and Kronos is overthrown by Zeus. And maybe someday Athena will overthrow Zeus, or maybe already has. Those are endings, but they're not the end. Period. Close the book. Same in Irish mythology of this conquering people and that conquering people and whatnot. And Ragnarok. And Ragnaroks.
Yeah. Versus, say, the Taoist mythology is you open the book in the middle, and thus it is.
There isn't a book. It's a process.
Yeah.
Ever-evolving fractal.
Yeah.
You can enter it at any point you want.
Yeah.
And you can exit it at any point you want to.
But you're never entering into a thing in the first place.
It is the thing.
The thing that cannot be spoken about.
So then
That is not a thing.
So then if we were to look at the modern mythology, there seems to be several competing mythologies to see which is the one that will become the dominant mythology. There's the environmental apocalypse mythology of the end times. It's actually a lot like Christianity. It's like the flip side of Christianity of the end times are coming, and it's going to be back in 1880, they're like, we're going to run out of food in like 1910, and there's not going to be enough food, and it's going to be the apocalypse. And that didn't happen. It's like, okay, 1930, we're going to run out of whatever. And then like 1970, we're going to run out of oil. And then 2000, and then now it's 2030 is the big thing of it has to change, or that's the end times by 2050. And then I'm sure in 2030, they'll be like, well, 2050 wasn't it, but in 2070, and then in 2070, like, okay, 2100, that's the end times. We're right.
Y2K 2.0.
Right. So there's the environmental apocalyptists. There's the right-wing Christian, or just Christian in general, that's like, this is the end times and all of this is normal because this is the end times. There's the like World Economic Forum of we need 1984 to be true, and that's kind of the ideal state of we just need someone that's smarter than everybody else and better than everybody else to be in charge, and they'll own everything, and everybody else just don't worry about it and be happy. Not in like the Bob Marley sense, but like in the you have no choice but to be happy. And then there's the Chinese mythology that China is going to eclipse the West and be the new superpower. And I'm sure the Russians have their own mythology of creating a stable state, which is, I don't know how that one works. I don't see any way that one succeeds. But I'm sure there's other mythologies too. Perhaps the libertarian idea of the big system gets too bloated and breaks down, and then Bitcoin and gold flow and everyone is happy and industrial and all the governments fall apart and somehow there's no chaos and governments get shrunk down to just the right size. You just need to trim just enough. If you trim too much, that's bad. You don't want anarchy.
I don't know. Some of us might want anarchy.
Right.
Are you tired of your socks always disappearing in the dryer? Do you wish you could communicate with your houseplants on a deeper level? Well, do we have news for you? Introducing the Quantum Socculator. Yes, you heard it right. The Quantum Socculator. It's not just a sock organizer, it's a portal to another dimension where socks roam free and household plants hold philosophical debates. But wait, there's more. Order now and receive a free subscription to our monthly newsletter, The Mystical Musings of Mismatched Socks, where we explore the existential questions behind the sock disappearance and the secret lives of pet rocks. So don't wait another minute. Call now and unlock the mysteries of the universe with the Quantum Socculator.
Problem? I'm going to call it a problem because I viewed it as a problem. With modern mythologies is that they're all taking cues from a really bastardized version of Christianity that I think destroyed something that was good. And I feel turning points are important and, human civilization's at a turning point right now. I don't think it's the turning point. But the problem that I feel too many mythologies are taking cues from one corrupt source and are missing a very complex rainbow of the human experience in the human world that they could be pulling a lot of very useful influence from and are missing out on the opportunity. So to me, I'm just really disappointed at the lack of mythological diversity that humans are coming up with right now. The groups that I'm most interested in is sort of like this Western combination of old paganism and semi-modern Nietzscheanism. Those two have merged together and has created a rather interesting mythology that's not particularly big right now, but I think has potential to explode in the future should the time be right.
I think some of the most interesting thinkers bringing more mythological themes and mythological tools to bear in the modern problems are kind of the decolonial movement. The decolonial movement that hasn't been subsumed by overly identitarian, there is good reason to adopt some of the interesting bits of the identitarian stuff, but some people, you show up to a class on decolonialism and you get a whole entirely identitarian thing, which I have my problems with. Value in it and problems anyway. And the post-activist kind of community is also doing some really interesting global comparison of how to engage with a world that is obviously at a turning point without relying on scientism or Christianity. The tools that have been in vogue in European cultures for the last however long.
500 years. Yeah. So then I wonder, we have all these competing mythologies in the human world right now. Is there one that you think either would be the one that's most likely to prevail, or alternately the one that you mentioned a little bit, Alien, of the one that you kind of hope or see promise with? Because most of those ones I laid out, you might have gathered from my tone, are not in themselves very complete mythologies. Most of them have, well, once we do this, it'll be okay. We just need to get Trump in power or make sure Biden stays in power. And that's as far as they go. That's the end times. And then after that, fairy dust and rainbows and it's all good.
So I think to that point, there's no mythology that I think can entirely encapsulate a civilization or a point in time. As we said earlier, Star Trek and Star Wars both came out of that same 60s post-World War globalist phenomena, but they have very different feels and went in very different directions, but they both captured the same thing. But there's only so much they can capture. Let's just throw out an arbitrary number and say that a mythology can only capture 70% of a current culture. It's not going to capture that 30%. If you want to get those 30%, you're going to have to make other mythologies. So I don't think there can be one mythology. That was tried with Christianity when the European empires were able to unify the world to a degree unthought of before, and that has failed. And so when you ask me the question, what mythology is going to be the one that prevails, I would answer that to not which one prevails, but what are the ones that prevail the best, because I believe there will be multiple.
Okay, so which are those?
There's a lot, actually. I like to spread my bets around a lot of things. It's a good market investment strategy. As I've said before, there's sort of a Nietzschean European paganist combination, which is small, but I think has the potential to explode under certain circumstances, which more and more it seems like we are entering that world where they have the potential to explode. Christianity can go in two directions, and I'm equally bullish on both of these. They might even occur at the same time, where Christianity reverts back to pre-Aquinas, pre-Occam, pre-scholastic system that it was. And then another one is that Christianity, and this is what I felt like, this is going to be a separate conversation to have, but I felt like Christianity was going in an arc. It started off henotheistic, became monotheistic. I thought it was going to turn into a non-theist religion, moving on from monotheist. And I'm wondering if, and it kind of, in the early thousands of years, got stalled in that direction. I'm wondering if that's going to continue, and that there's going to be a new form of Christianity that instead of being monotheistic is going to be non-theistic.
Like an exponential decay of godhood?
Yes. We'll have to have a separate conversation about sub-religions and what I mean by non-theism versus monotheism. But if you read the New Testament through to the New Testament, God slowly disappears from the story to the point where in the New Testament he says a couple sentences and never shows up or is even mentioned that much.
Occam getting razor happy.
Tiger, you looked like you were about to say something.
So I don't make predictions much anymore.
You're also a smart man.
Too many years
Not
dealing with humans. I'm a male tiger. I can be a man if I want. Just not a human. Anyway. As for mythologies going forward, before we turned the microphone on, me and Alien were having a brief conversation about the utility of postmodernism. And while I think there's a lot of bullshit in postmodernism, one of the most useful things is a stance of multi-mythological ambivalence. And I mean that in the being able to juggle lovingly multiple mythologies and use them for when they're useful. Because I think mythologies, like any other map, break down at a certain point when you use them predictively, as you classified mythologies as being. Or, honestly, any three of your utilities. The ideal person is not ideal in all situations. The wrong action is not wrong in all situations. The explanation of why leaves turn orange is going to depend on what time of year it is and how much you've watered the plant. So context is always essential to a map. So having multiple maps and having multiple mythologies that you've invested in and engaged with the people in and drawn your blood into is the most useful position for any individual person to have. And I think all cultures do this to some degree, whether it's Christianity largely is monomythic, but even in that, there's different traditions and different saints and different stories and allegories and things that you can draw on to apply to different situations. Because sometimes you gotta flip tables, and sometimes you have to forgive your neighbor.
So then that outlook would be like you're sailing by landmarks and you're trying to get where you're going, and you reference the landmark. And if you're at a landmark, you just shipwrecked. So you don't want to go to the landmark. You just want to use the landmarks for navigation.
I like that a lot.
And for orientation of where am I in this sea of human potential. And I'm like, oh, I'm really close to that Christianity thing, or I want to go more towards that libertarian landmark, or oop, we went too far that way. Look at the collectivist mythological landmark. Let's sail that way because the sea's got a little rough over here.
Yeah, and sometimes you need to land in port, but you don't want to crash into the port.
Right.
Ships don't do well on land, even if they do need to touch land sometimes.
I think it's important for humans to remember that you live in a plural verse, not a universe, despite what the current monomyths, plural, would tell you.
Amen. And with that, I think we're going to wrap it up. Until next time, I have been and continue to be Tiger.
I am alien and I'm freezing.
I am an example of robot.
Thank you for listening to Alien Robot Tiger. If you've enjoyed the show, please consider joining us on Patreon for bonus content and private Discord access.